March 15, 2023. Victor Castellano had been running acting workshops for nobodies for 3 years, washed-up wannabes who paid $50 to pretend they had talent. That Tuesday, a man walked in who made Victor's blood turn cold. Daniel Bronson, construction boots, calloused hands, the same stone face that had stared Victor down in an interrogation room 20 years ago. Victor watched him sign in, knowing this wasn't about acting. When Daniel stepped forward for his audition, the room went silent. He looked straight at Victor and spoke 6 words that made everyone freeze. 6 words that shattered 20 years of careful lies. The workshop students thought it was method acting. Victor knew better. This was the moment he'd been dreading since 2003. The moment Detective Daniel Bronson finally came to collect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The 6 words hung in the stale air like smoke from a gun barrel. I remember everything about Jamie Martinez. Victor's throat constricted. His fingers gripped the edge of his metal folding chair until his knuckles went white. Around him, the 12 workshop students shifted uncomfortably, sensing something electric and dangerous crackling between their instructor and this stranger in work boots. Interesting choice, Victor managed, his voice barely steady. But that's only 6 words. Usually we ask for a full monologue. Daniel Bronson didn't move, didn't blink. 20 years had carved deep lines around his eyes and salted his hair, but those same pale blue eyes that had dissected Victor in that downtown precinct interrogation room remained unchanged. Predator's eyes, patient and unforgiving. Sometimes 6 words are enough, Daniel said. The workshop studio was a far cry from the gleaming offices Victor once commanded at Meridian Pictures. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. Motivational posters peeled from water-stained walls. Every expert was once a beginner and believe in yourself. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 years he'd been running this pathetic operation. 3 years of teaching trust fund kids and middle-aged divorcees how to find their truth in scene work. 3 years of pretending he was just another has-been who'd lost his touch, not a man who'd fled Hollywood with blood on his hands. Well, Victor said, forcing his trademark sardonic smile. That was certainly memorable. Let's move on to the next. I'm not finished. Daniel's voice cut through the room like a blade. The students exchanged glances. Maria Hernandez, a timid dental hygienist who'd been coming for 6 months, clutched her purse tighter. Brad Wilson, an aging soap opera reject with delusions of grandeur, leaned forward with obvious excitement. They thought this was part of the show. Raw, authentic drama unfolding before their eyes. If only they knew. Victor stood slowly, his legs unsteady. Actually, I think we should take a break. Everyone, let's reconvene in 15 minutes. Sit down, Victor. The command froze him halfway to standing. Daniel hadn't raised his voice, but something in his tone, the same quiet authority he'd wielded as a detective, made Victor's body betray him. He sank back into his chair like a scolded child. You see, Daniel continued, his gaze never leaving Victor's face, I've been thinking about that night for 20 years. December 18, 2003. The Chateau Marmont, room 64. A 22-year-old actor named Jamie Martinez, dead from what the coroner ruled an accidental overdose. The workshop students were transfixed now. This was better than anything they'd seen on Netflix. Real human drama, raw and unfiltered. Victor's mouth had gone dry. I don't know what you're... The needle was still in his arm when housekeeping found him the next morning. High-grade heroin. Pure stuff. Not the kind of thing a struggling actor from East LA could usually afford. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket, and Victor's heart hammered against his ribs. But Daniel only pulled out a worn manila folder. Funny thing about cold cases, Victor. They never really go cold for the people who live them. The folder landed on the scuffed coffee table between them with a soft thud. Even from his chair, Victor could see the corner of a police photograph peeking out. Jamie's face, slack and pale against Egyptian cotton sheets that cost more than most people made in a month. I lost my badge over that case, Daniel said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Wouldn't let it go. Kept pushing when my captain told me to file it and move on. kept asking uncomfortable questions about why a nobody actor was staying in a $500 a night suite, why there were no fingerprints on that needle except his, why the security footage from the hallway mysteriously malfunctioned for exactly 47 minutes. Brad Wilson's eyes were wide as saucers. Jesus, this is incredible. Is this from your new show? Victor wanted to laugh, or scream, or run. But Daniel's presence pinned him to that chair like a butterfly on display, wings spread and helpless. 20 years is a long time to think, Daniel continued. Long time to piece things together. Long time to track down witnesses who scattered like roaches when the lights came on. Long time to follow money trails that certain people thought they'd buried deep enough. The folder seemed to pulse on the table between them, a beating heart full of secrets Victor had paid everything to keep buried. His career, his reputation, his soul. So here's what's going to happen, Daniel said, finally moving closer. Each step deliberate and measured. You're going to give me the performance of your lifetime, Victor, because 20 years ago you helped cover up a murder, and now it's time for your final audition. The workshop students burst into spontaneous applause, convinced they'd just witnessed the most authentic acting they'd ever seen. But Victor heard only the sound of his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble, one devastating word at a time. The applause died away like echoes in an empty theater. Victor's hands trembled as he reached for his coffee mug, the chipped ceramic one with "World's Greatest Dad" painted in fading letters. A Father's Day gift from his daughter Emma when she was 8, back when she still looked at him with starlight in her eyes instead of the careful distance that had grown between them over the years. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he needed something to do with his hands, something normal, something that might ground him in this fluorescent-lit purgatory he'd built for himself. That was intense, Maria whispered to the woman beside her. I've never seen acting like that. Victor's laugh came out strangled. If only they knew this wasn't acting. This was archaeology, the careful excavation of bones he'd spent 2 decades burying deeper and deeper until he'd almost convinced himself they'd never existed at all. Daniel remained standing in the center of the room, patient as a gravestone. The manila folder sat between them like a loaded gun, and Victor found himself cataloging everything he stood to lose. This studio, pathetic as it was, represented 3 years of slowly rebuilding something resembling a life. The apartment 6 blocks away, with its second-hand furniture and framed pictures of Emma, school plays, graduation, her wedding where she'd asked him to walk her down the aisle despite everything. The Tuesday phone calls where they talked carefully around the crater his past had blown through their relationship, the quiet life he'd scraped together from the wreckage. All right, everyone, Victor said, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. Let's take that break now, 15 minutes. Brad Wilson lingered, clearly hoping for more drama, but Victor's glare sent him shuffling toward the door with the others. Maria touched his arm gently as she passed. You okay, Mr. Castellano? You look pale. The kindness in her voice nearly undid him. These people trusted him. They came here week after week, paying their modest fees to learn something he'd once mastered, the art of making people believe in stories. Now the only story that mattered was the one he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The studio emptied except for Victor and Daniel. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Outside, traffic hummed on Olive Avenue. Ordinary people going about ordinary lives, unaware that in this shabby room above a Korean barbecue restaurant, the past was finally collecting its debts. Victor stood on unsteady legs and walked to the window. The view was nothing special. A strip mall parking lot, a bus stop where teenagers clustered with their phones, a billboard advertising some forgettable summer blockbuster. But it was his view, his small corner of a world where nobody knew what he'd done. She's getting married next month, he said quietly, not turning around. Emma, my daughter, 2nd time. First husband was a mistake, too young, you know, but this one's different. David, he's a teacher, good man, patient. Victor's reflection stared back at him from the grimy glass. She asked me to give a toast at the reception. Behind him, Daniel said nothing. Waiting. Always waiting. Funny thing about having a daughter, Victor continued. Makes you see every young person as someone's child. Jamie was somebody's son. Had a mother who called the studio 17 times after he died, asking questions I couldn't answer. He pressed his palm against the cool glass. I told myself I was protecting the industry, protecting careers, but really, I was just protecting myself. The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy and acrid. Victor had never said those words aloud before, not even to the therapist Emma had begged him to see after his breakdown. Some truths were too sharp to voice. They cut your throat on the way out. I have pictures of her on my phone, Victor said. Emma. Want to see? He turned around, pulling out his phone with hands that had steadied somewhat. Daniel's expression hadn't changed, but something flickered in those pale eyes. Recognition, maybe, or pity. Victor scrolled through the photos. Emma at her bridal shower, radiant in a blue dress. Emma and David at the beach, sand in her dark hair, laughing at something off camera. Emma as a child, gap-toothed and grinning beside a younger Victor at Disneyland, back when he'd been someone worth looking up to. She doesn't know, Victor said, about Jamie, about any of it. She thinks I just lost my edge, made some bad business decisions. If this comes out, he looked up at Daniel, she'll lose everything too. The teaching job, the wedding, the life she's built, guilt by association. You know how this town works. Daniel's jaw worked silently. The manila folder seemed to grow heavier on the coffee table between them, weighted with 20 years of careful investigation and patient rage. In the distance, a siren wailed. Ambulance or police, Victor couldn't tell, but the sound made his chest tighten with the old familiar panic, the certainty that someday they would come for him. He just hadn't expected his reckoning to walk through the door wearing work boots and carrying a folder full of ghosts. Daniel opened the folder. The sound of paper rustling was deafening in the empty studio. Victor's phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the linoleum. Emma's smiling face disappeared as the screen went dark, leaving only the harsh fluorescent lights, and the smell of kimchi drifting up from the restaurant below. Sit down, Daniel said without looking up. Victor's legs folded beneath him like a marionette with cut strings. He found himself back in the metal chair, watching Daniel's weathered fingers sort through photographs and documents with the methodical precision of a man who'd had 20 years to organize his evidence. The first photograph landed on the coffee table face up. Jamie Martinez, alive, laughing at some long-forgotten premiere. Young and beautiful and doomed, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than his family's monthly rent. Victor remembered that night, Meridian Pictures' celebration for some forgettable romantic comedy. He'd introduced Jamie to Marcus Wolfe, the studio executive with wandering hands and expensive tastes. The devil's bargain disguised as opportunity. December 15, 2003, Daniel said, placing a second photo beside the first. 3 days before Jamie died, hotel security footage shows him entering the Chateau Marmont with Marcus Wolfe at 11:47 p.m. The grainy black and white image was hard to make out, but Victor recognized the shapes. 2 figures walking through the Art Deco lobby, one older and confident, the other hesitant, a lamb following a wolf. Wolfe checked them into the suite under his corporate account, Daniel continued. Champagne, room service, party favors, all on the studio's dime. Very generous for a promising young actor who'd only had 3 lines in a cop show. More photographs, credit card receipts, phone records. 20 years of detective work spread across Victor's coffee table like tarot cards, predicting a future written in blood and shame. Victor's mouth had turned to dust. Where did you get all this? Wolfe kept records. Insurance, he called it. Made sure he had leverage on everyone involved. Daniel pulled out a manila envelope, thicker than the others, including you. The photographs that spilled out made Victor's vision blur at the edges. Security footage from Meridian Pictures, timestamped December 18, 2003, 6:23 a.m. Victor himself, younger and sharper in his $1,000 suit, walking quickly through the executive parking garage with something under his arm. Even in the grainy image, the needle and the small glass vial were unmistakable. You took them from Wolfe's office, Daniel said. Cleaned up the evidence before the investigation could begin. Made sure Jamie looked like just another junkie who couldn't handle the pressure. Victor's chest felt crushed, as if the weight of 20 years had suddenly materialized and settled on his sternum. How did you... Wolfe got sloppy, kept using young actors, kept keeping records. When he died last year, liver cancer, very slow, very painful, His estate needed to liquidate everything. Amazing what people will sell to settle debts. The room began to spin. Marcus Wolf, dead. The man whose sins Victor had helped bury, whose secrets had cost Victor everything, had been dying while Victor taught trust fund kids how to project their voices and find their light. His assistant kept copies. Daniel continued relentlessly. Brenda Walsh. Remember her? She remembered you, remembered how you showed up that morning, looking like you'd seen a ghost, how you and Wolf spent 3 hours in his office with the door locked, how the studio's head of security happened to develop selective amnesia about the Chateau Marmont footage. Another photograph. A check stub, made out to Brenda Walsh for $50,000, signed by Victor Castellano. Hush money, paid from his personal account 3 days after Jamie's funeral. She kept it all, Daniel said. Photographs, recordings, documents, insurance policy of her own. And when Wolf's cancer got bad and he started talking to his priest, started wanting to make amends, she got nervous, started reaching out to old contacts, retired cops who might be interested in cold cases with new evidence. The folder was nearly empty now, its contents spread across the table like an autopsy report. Victor saw his life dissected in black and white. The phone calls to fix the coroner's report, the payments to silence witnesses, the careful orchestration of a cover-up that had consumed his soul one compromise at a time. But Daniel wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind detectives had used before smartphones made everything easier. Wolf confessed everything to Father Michael at St. Augustine's, Daniel said, setting the recorder down with careful precision. Dying men tell the truth, Victor. They want absolution. They want to name names. Victor stared at the device as if it were a snake coiled to strike. His phone buzzed against the floor where he'd dropped it, probably Emma, texting about wedding plans or weekend visits. Life continuing its forward momentum, unaware that the past had finally caught up. 20 years, Daniel said quietly. 20 years I've waited for this moment. 20 years Jamie's mother died thinking her son was just another Hollywood casualty. The recorder's red light began to blink. Now it's your turn to tell the truth. The red light pulsed like a mechanical heartbeat. Victor's hands pressed flat against his thighs, fingers digging into the worn fabric of pants he'd bought at Target, a far cry from the Armani suits that once hung in his walk-in closet like armor against the world. Turn it off. The words came out strangled, barely recognizable as his own voice. Daniel's finger hovered over the device but didn't move. 20 years, Victor. 20 years of silence. Jamie's mother, Rosa Martinez, died 3 years ago. Cervical cancer. Spent her last months believing her son killed himself because he couldn't handle Hollywood. Died thinking she failed as a mother. The fluorescent light above them flickered, casting intermittent shadows across the evidence spread between them. Victor's gaze kept returning to the photograph of himself in that parking garage, carrying death in his hands like a gift. He barely remembered that morning, the phone call that had shattered his sleep, Wolf's voice sharp with panic. We have a problem. A big fucking problem. I didn't kill him, Victor said, his voice gaining strength. Wolf gave him the drugs, not me. I just what? Just helped cover it up? Just made sure the investigation went nowhere? Just took money to silence witnesses while a mother buried her child? Daniel leaned forward, and Victor caught the scent of sawdust and honest sweat. You turned a murder into a footnote, Victor. A promising kid became another cautionary tale about Hollywood's dark side. Victor's phone buzzed again against the linoleum. The sound made him flinch, and he found himself thinking about Emma's last text. Dad, David's parents want to meet you before the wedding. Maybe dinner Friday? I know it's awkward, but it would mean everything to me. He'd stared at that message for an hour, crafting and deleting responses. How do you explain to your daughter's future in-laws that you're not just a failed casting director, but a man who'd helped bury a boy barely older than their own son? She doesn't deserve this, Victor said, gesturing toward his fallen phone. Emma, she's innocent. She was 12 when this happened. She doesn't even remember Jamie Martinez. But I do. Daniel's voice carried the weight of 2 decades. I remember his audition tape. Kid could barely afford the equipment, shot it in his grandmother's kitchen. But he had something, real talent, Not the manufactured kind you people sold. The recorder continued its mechanical breathing. In the silence, Victor could hear the muffled sounds of life continuing outside. Car doors slamming, teenagers laughing, the ordinary symphony of a Tuesday afternoon in Burbank. His students would be returning soon, expecting their teacher to guide them through scene work and emotional truth. The irony tasted like copper in his mouth. "What do you want?" Victor asked finally. "Money? I don't have much. This place barely breaks even. The apartment—" "I don't want your money." Daniel's interruption was sharp. "I want justice. I want the truth on record. I want Jamie's name cleared. His name was destroyed." Daniel's composure cracked for the first time, revealing the rage that had sustained him through 20 years of patient investigation. Every article, every obituary, every mention painted him as another weak kid who couldn't handle the pressure. Another junkie who took the easy way out. His family carried that shame. His little sister changed her last name because she was tired of people whispering. Victor closed his eyes, but the darkness only made the memories sharper. Jamie's funeral, a small service in East LA that Victor had watched from across the street, too much of a coward to face the boy's family. Rosa Martinez in a black dress that had seen too many funerals, holding a photograph of her son, while a priest spoke about God's plan and eternal rest. Victor had thrown up in the church parking lot afterward, bile and guilt painting the asphalt like truth. "The statute of limitations," he began weakly. "Expired for the cover-up, yes. But murder doesn't have an expiration date, and new evidence—" Daniel tapped the recorder. "New evidence changes everything." The studio door opened with its familiar creak. Maria Hernandez peeked inside, her face bright with anticipated drama. "Sorry, are we interrupting? That scene was just incredible." "Get out!" Victor's voice exploded from his chest with such force that Maria stumbled backward. "All of you, get out! Class is canceled, permanently." The door slammed shut, followed by the sound of confused voices and retreating footsteps. Victor's breathing came in ragged gasps, his carefully constructed world crumbling like a movie set revealed as plywood and paint. Daniel watched this dissolution with the patience of a man who had waited decades for this moment. The recorder kept spinning, hungry for truth. 30 seconds, Victor. 30 seconds to decide how this story ends, with dignity or in handcuffs. The 30 seconds stretched into eternity. Victor's pulse hammered against his temples, each beat marking time he'd stolen from Jamie Martinez, time he'd borrowed from truth, time that was finally running out. "You don't understand," Victor whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent lights. "I tried to stop it. That night, December 15th, I knew what Wolf was planning. I'd seen him with others, young actors desperate for their break, willing to do anything for a callback." Daniel's hand remained poised over the recorder, but something shifted in his expression. The detective's patience, honed by decades of interrogations, recognized a confession beginning to bleed. "I called Jamie." The words tumbled out like a dam bursting. 3 times that night, tried to warn him away, but Wolf had already promised him the lead in that war picture. Brothers in Arms, $40 million budget, star-making role. Victor's laugh came out broken. Kid was sending money home to his mother, supporting his grandmother's medical bills. He couldn't afford to say no. The photographs on the table seemed to rearrange themselves in Victor's peripheral vision, becoming accusatory faces. Jamie laughing at the premiere. Jamie entering the hotel. Jamie cold and still on a stretcher that Victor never saw but imagined every night for 20 years. "So I followed him to the Chateau Marmont," Victor continued, his voice gaining momentum like a confession in free fall. "Waited in the lobby, told myself I'd intervene if things went too far. But Wolf had security. They kept me downstairs until—" He swallowed hard, until it was too late. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "That's not in any of the reports. Because I never told anyone. I sat in that Art Deco lobby for 4 hours, drinking overpriced whiskey and convincing myself that Jamie was just another ambitious kid making a calculated choice, that Wolf was just networking, that the needle in his briefcase was for diabetes, not—" Victor's hands began to shake. I heard the sirens at 3:47 a.m. watched the paramedics carry him out. His lips were blue. The confession hung between them like a living thing, feeding on 20 years of suppressed guilt. Outside, Victor heard his students' voices growing distant. Maria asking Brad what they'd done wrong, why Mr. Castellano had erupted like that. They'd never know they'd witnessed the moment when Victor's carefully constructed fiction finally met its author. The next morning, Wolf called. Victor's voice had become mechanical, reciting facts like evidence at trial. Said there would be an investigation, that my name was in Jamie's phone from those calls I'd made trying to warn him, that the lobby footage showed me there all night drinking alone while a kid died upstairs. How would that look? Hollywood casting director watches young actor die, does nothing to help. Daniel's jaw worked silently. The recorder continued its digital breathing, consuming truth like oxygen. So I became complicit. Took the evidence Wolf needed destroyed, paid the bribes, made the calls, turned murder into misadventure. Victor looked down at his hands, older now, spotted with age, but still carrying the weight of that December morning 20 years ago. I told myself I was protecting the industry, protecting careers, but really, I was just protecting myself from being exposed as a coward. You were there. Daniel's voice carried a strange note, not surprise, but something deeper, recognition. The night manager mentioned a man in the lobby, well-dressed, drinking alone, wouldn't give his name when questioned. We could never track him down, because Wolf paid him to forget. Victor met Daniel's eyes for the first time since the interrogation began. $50,000 to lose a witness statement. Same amount I paid Brenda Walsh to lose Wolf's security footage. Same amount I paid 3 different people to forget what they knew about that night. The studio felt smaller now, as if the confession had compressed the air itself. Victor's breathing came in short gasps, and he realized he was hyperventilating. The same panic response that had sent him to the emergency room 6 months after Jamie's funeral, convinced he was having a heart attack. I've been dying for 20 years, Victor said quietly. Every morning, every night. Every time Emma called and said she was proud of me. Every time a student thanked me for helping them find their truth. I've been carrying Jamie Martinez's death in my chest like a tumor. Daniel reached toward the recorder, and Victor tensed, expecting judgment. Instead, the older man's voice was gentler than it had any right to be. Marcus Wolf died screaming, Daniel said. Cancer ate him from the inside out. But dying scared doesn't balance the scales. It doesn't bring Jamie back. It doesn't give Rosa Martinez the peace she deserved. The red light continued blinking, waiting. Tell me about the needle, Victor. Tell me exactly what you destroyed. The needle. Victor's hands clenched into fists as the memory crystallized with surgical precision. 20 years of careful burial, and now every detail emerged sharp enough to cut. It wasn't just one needle, he said, his voice hollow. There were 3. Clean pharmaceutical grade, still in sterile packaging. The words felt like glass in his throat. And 2 vials, pharmaceutical heroin, pure enough to kill an elephant, let alone a kid who'd never touched anything stronger than beer. Daniel's face remained impassive, but Victor caught the slight tensing around his eyes. The detective had been fishing, and Victor had just handed him the murder weapon wrapped in a confession. Wolf kept them in his office safe. His insurance policy, he called it. Evidence that he'd planned Jamie's death down to the milligram. Victor's laugh came out strangled. You want to know the sick part? He showed them to me 3 days before Jamie died. Bragged about how untraceable they were, how a coroner would just see another Hollywood overdose. The studio's fluorescent light flickered again, casting intermittent shadows that made the photographs on the table seem to move. Jamie laughing, Jamie walking to his death, Jamie becoming a statistic. I destroyed them in my kitchen sink, Victor continued, unable to stop now that the dam had burst. Melted the vials with a blowtorch, ground the needles down the garbage disposal. Flushed everything with bleach and industrial solvent. He looked up at Daniel, seeing 20 years of patient investigation reflected in those weathered features. But you already knew that, didn't you? Daniel reached into his jacket, not for another photograph this time, but for a second recording device. Smaller, more professional, the kind that could capture conversations from across a room. Wolf didn't just confess to Father Michael, Daniel said quietly. He confessed to you. The second recorder hit the table with the sound of a gavel. Victor's world tilted sideways as understanding crashed over him like a collapsing building. "The phone call last month," he whispered. "Cancer ward at Cedars-Sinai. You said you were calling to apologize, to make amends before I died, yes." Daniel's voice carried 20 years of patient fury. "But I wasn't the one dying, Victor. I was just the messenger." The truth rearranged itself like broken bones setting wrong. Every assumption Victor had made, every carefully constructed narrative about Daniel's investigation, crumbled into dust. "Wolf reached out to you himself," Victor said, his voice barely audible, dying scared, wanting absolution, but not from a priest, from the one person who knew exactly what he'd destroyed. Daniel nodded slowly. Terminal liver cancer. 6 weeks to live, maybe 8. Spend his last conscious moments trying to buy his way into heaven with other people's secrets. He gestured toward the evidence spread across the table, including yours. Victor's phone buzzed again against the linoleum. Emma's ringtone, "Here Comes the Sun," the same Beatles song he'd sung to her as a child when nightmares woke her up. The irony now felt like a blade between his ribs. "That night you called me," Victor said, pieces falling into place like a puzzle solving itself backwards. "You weren't investigating. You were delivering Wolf's final message. He wanted you to know he'd kept everything. Every photograph, every document, every piece of evidence you thought was buried." Daniel's voice carried the weight of a man who'd spent 2 decades building a case on dead man's confessions. "And he wanted you to know that justice doesn't have an expiration date." The fluorescent light above them died completely, leaving only the natural illumination filtering through grimy windows. In the half-light, Daniel looked less like a retired construction worker and more like what he'd always been, a detective who never stopped detecting. "You played me," Victor said, and despite everything, he felt a grudging admiration for the craftsmanship of it. 20 years of preparation, building a case file from a dead man's insurance policy, using my own guilt as bait. "I didn't have to play you, Victor." Daniel's response cut deeper than anger would have. "You played yourself. Every lie you told, every compromise you made, every night you stayed awake listening for sirens, that was all you." The recording devices continued their mechanical breathing, feeding on 20 years of suppressed truth. Outside, Victor could hear his students' cars pulling away, their confused voices fading into the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday afternoon in Burbank. They'd never know they'd witnessed the moment when the past finally caught up with itself. Victor closed his eyes and saw Emma in her wedding dress, radiant with the kind of innocent joy that his choices had stolen from Jamie Martinez's family. When he opened them again, Daniel was watching him with something that might have been pity. "There's one more thing," Daniel said softly. "Something Wolf wanted you to know before he died." He reached into his jacket one final time. The object Daniel withdrew wasn't another piece of evidence. It was a letter, yellowed with age, the envelope bearing Victor's name in handwriting he recognized with sick certainty. His own handwriting, from 20 years ago. "The resignation letter you never sent," Daniel said, placing it carefully beside the photographs. "To the studio, to the Casting Directors Guild, to everyone who trusted you." He paused, letting the weight of recognition settle. "Wolf found it in your office the morning after Jamie died. You'd written it, signed it, even addressed the envelopes, but you never had the courage to mail them." Victor's breath caught in his throat. He remembered that morning, sitting at his desk at 4 a.m., still wearing the same clothes from the Chateau Marmont lobby, his hands shaking as he tried to find words for the inexcusable. "I am writing to inform you of my immediate resignation from all professional duties, effective immediately. Recent events have made it clear that I am no longer fit to serve in a position of trust." "I was going to quit," he whispered, the memory sharp as fresh glass. "Walk away from everything. Let the investigation follow its natural course, even if it destroyed me." "But Wolf convinced you otherwise." Daniel's voice held no judgment, only the patient accumulation of truth. "Told you that running would look like guilt, that staying quiet was the only way to protect yourself, and eventually you believed him." The letter sat between them like an accusation. Victor could see his younger self's desperate scrawl, the ink smeared where tears had fallen. He'd been a different man then, still capable of shame, still believing that confession might lead to redemption. "He kept everything," Victor said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "Not just evidence of the murder, evidence of who I used to be, who I could have been." Daniel nodded slowly. His insurance policy wasn't just about protecting himself from prosecution. It was about making sure that if he went down, everyone went down with him. Your letter, your phone records, even security footage from that lobby, he had it all. The recording devices continued their digital breathing, patient as vultures. Victor found himself thinking about the students he'd just screamed at, their confused faces as his carefully constructed persona cracked apart. Maria Hernandez, barely older than Jamie had been, trying to build a career in the same industry that had devoured that boy like a machine built for murder. "There's more," Daniel said, his voice growing softer, "about Jamie's family, about what they never knew." Victor braced himself, but nothing could have prepared him for what came next. Jamie had a son. The words hit Victor like a physical blow. 9 months after he died, his girlfriend Elena gave birth, a boy named James. She never told anyone who the father was, too ashamed of her connection to the scandal, too afraid it would hurt the child's chances. The studio walls seemed to close in around them. Victor's vision blurred, and for a moment he was back in that lobby, watching paramedics carry out a boy who would never meet his own child. "Elena died in a car accident when James was 7, Daniel continued remorselessly. "The boy went into the system, foster care. He's 20 now, works at a garage in Riverside, has no idea his father was an actor, no idea his father was murdered." Victor's hands found the edge of the table, gripping until his knuckles went white. Does he look like his father?" "Yes." Daniel reached into his jacket one final time, producing a photograph that made Victor's heart stop entirely. A young man with Jamie's eyes, Jamie's smile, working under the hood of a car, alive, real, denied 20 years of knowing his father's story. "His name is James Martinez Santos. Goes by Jimmy. He thinks his father was just another deadbeat who couldn't handle responsibility." Daniel's voice carried decades of accumulated fury. "Because that's the story the world told him, the story you helped write." The fluorescent light above them gave one final flicker and died completely. In the natural light filtering through grimy windows, Victor could see everything clearly for the first time in 20 years. The web of lies he'd helped spin, the lives destroyed not just by Jamie's death, but by the carefully constructed fiction that followed. His phone buzzed one more time. Emma probably worried about his silence, but Victor couldn't bring himself to look, couldn't bear to see another message from someone who still believed in the man he'd pretended to be. "What happens now?" Victor asked, his voice barely audible. Daniel leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since entering the studio, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Now," he said, "you tell the truth, all of it. Starting with 6 words that are going to change everything." The recorder waited, hungry for justice 20 years delayed. Victor stared at the recording device, its red light pulsing like a mechanical heartbeat counting down the seconds of his old life. 20 years of careful construction, of lies built on lies, of a reputation rebuilt from ashes, all of it waiting to collapse with 6 words. "I helped Marcus Wolfe murder Jamie." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Daniel's finger hovered over the recorder, but he didn't move to stop it. The confession hung in the air between them, irreversible as death itself. Victor felt something break inside his chest, not his heart, but something deeper. The carefully maintained wall between who he'd been and who he'd become. For 20 years, he'd carried 2 versions of himself: the guilty man who'd watched a boy walk to his death, and the respectable teacher who helped young actors find their truth. Now, finally, there was only one. "Again," Daniel said quietly. "For the record, with context. On December 15, 2004, I helped Marcus Wolfe murder Jamie Martinez. I provided opportunity, I destroyed evidence, and I participated in a conspiracy to cover up the crime." Victor's voice grew stronger with each word, as if confession was oxygen after decades of suffocation. Everything that followed, the investigation, the ruling of accidental overdose, the burial of Marcus Wolf's crimes. I enabled it all. Daniel reached across the table and turned off the recorder. The sudden silence felt deafening. "Do you know what those words just did?" Daniel asked. "Ended everything," Victor replied. But strangely, he felt no panic, only a profound exhaustion, as if he'd been holding his breath for 20 years and could finally exhale. They gave Jimmy Martinez his father back. Victor looked down at the photograph of Jamie's son, alive, real, denied his history by Victor's cowardice. The boy had his father's hands, the same long fingers that had gestured so expressively during that final audition, the role that had killed him. "What happens to him now?" Victor asked. "When this comes out?" "That depends," Daniel said, "on how much of the truth you're willing to tell. Wolf kept financial records too, payments to witnesses, bribes to officials, money laundering through shell production companies. Your confession opens doors that have been locked for 20 years. Victor's phone buzzed again. This time he looked. Emma's text was simple. "Dad, you've been quiet all day. Everything okay? Love you." The words that had once comforted him now felt like accusations. Love built on lies. Pride based on performance. A daughter who believed her father was a good man because he'd become a master at playing one. "I need to call her," Victor said. "After," Daniel replied firmly. "First, we finish this. All of it. Every name, every payment, every piece of evidence you destroyed." Wolf's confession was detailed, but it was a dying man's rambling. "Your testimony will be a prosecutor's roadmap." Victor nodded, understanding the magnitude of what Daniel was asking. Not just confession, but full cooperation. Not just admitting guilt, but becoming the key that unlocked a conspiracy 2 decades old. "There were others," Victor said slowly. "Other actors. Before Jamie Wolf had a pattern. Young men, usually Latino or black, desperate for their break. He'd promise them star-making roles, get them alone, and then—" He swallowed hard. "I knew. I always knew. But Jamie was the first one who died." Daniel's expression didn't change, but something cold moved behind his eyes. "Names. Carlos Mendoza, died in 2001, ruled suicide. Andre Washington, 2003, car accident that was anything but accidental. Tommy Chen, 2002, drowning in his apartment building's pool." The names came out like a litany, boys who'd become statistics while Victor climbed the Hollywood ladder built on their graves. "I never had direct knowledge, never saw evidence, but the pattern was clear to anyone willing to look. And you never looked." "I looked," Victor said quietly. "I just never acted. Every time I told myself it was suspicion, not proof, that my career, my reputation, my family's security mattered more than unsubstantiated fears." Daniel restarted the recorder. "Say it again. For them." Victor closed his eyes and saw their faces, young men who'd come to Hollywood with dreams, who'd trusted the system that Victor represented. When he opened them, his voice was steady. "I am Victor Castellano. For 20 years, I've been an accessory to multiple murders committed by Marcus Wolf. I chose silence over justice, career over conscience, and personal comfort over the truth. I helped a serial killer operate in plain sight, because exposing him would have exposed me." The confession finished, Victor looked at Daniel and saw something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but profound sadness. "What happens now?" Victor asked. Daniel stood slowly, his movements carrying the weight of 2 decades spent building this moment. "Now," he said, "justice catches up." The sirens arrived 20 minutes later, their wailing cutting through the Burbank afternoon like a blade through old fabric. Victor sat motionless as Daniel made the calls, first to the district attorney's office, then to the FBI's cold case unit, finally to a number he'd apparently kept memorized for 20 years. "Jimmy?" Daniel's voice carried across the studio as he spoke into his phone. "It's Detective Bronson. We've never met, but I knew your father. I have something to tell you about him." Victor listened to one side of a conversation that would shatter and rebuild a young man's understanding of his own history. Outside, he could see unmarked cars pulling up beside the marked units, federal agents in dark suits, moving with the careful efficiency of people who'd been preparing for this moment as long as Daniel had. The studio door opened, and Victor's old life ended. 6 months later. The courtroom in downtown Los Angeles was smaller than Victor had expected. After decades in Hollywood, he'd grown accustomed to grand stages, dramatic lighting, audiences that filled vast theaters. Justice, it turned out, happened in fluorescent-lit rooms with uncomfortable chairs and the constant whisper of air conditioning. From the witness stand, Victor could see Jimmy Martinez in the gallery. 20 years old, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, listening to the story of his father's murder with Jamie's own dark eyes. The boy, man, Victor corrected himself, had his father's intensity, the same focused attention that had made Jamie so compelling on camera. "Mr. Castellano," the prosecutor said, "in your own words, please describe the events of December 15th, 2004. Victor had told the story dozens of times now, to federal investigators, to grand juries, to the families of Carlos Mendoza and Andre Washington and Tommy Chen. Each telling had carved away another piece of the man he'd pretended to be, until only the truth remained. Marcus Wolf called me at approximately 2 p.m., Victor began, his voice steady. He told me Jamie Martinez had been asking questions about the other actors, about the pattern of deaths. Wolf said he needed to handle the situation before Jamie could become a problem. In the gallery, Jimmy leaned forward. This was the part he'd never heard before, the moment his father had tried to be a hero. I should have warned Jamie, should have called the police. Instead, I told Wolf I didn't want to know any details. I said, just make it look natural. The words still tasted like ashes. Those 6 words made me an accessory to murder. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Victor testified against dead Marcus Wolf and living conspirators, against studio executives who'd enabled the cover-up and officials who'd been bought with blood money. His testimony unraveled a network of corruption that stretched from Burbank sound stages to the mayor's office. When it was over, Victor was sentenced to 15 years for accessory to murder and conspiracy. With good behavior and his cooperation, the judge said, he might serve 8. 1 year later, California State Prison, Chino. The visiting room smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Victor sat across from Emma, his daughter's face older now, marked by the kind of knowledge that changed people forever. Jimmy Martinez came to see me last week, she said without preamble. Did you know he's going to college? Criminal justice. Says he wants to be a detective, like the man who found his father's truth. Victor nodded. He'd heard. Daniel Bronson had apparently taken the boy under his wing, helping him navigate the media attention and the victim's compensation fund that had finally acknowledged his father's murder. Are you angry? Victor asked. It was the question that had haunted him through every sleepless night since his arrest. Emma was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried echoes of the little girl who'd once believed her father could do no wrong. I'm angry that you lied, she said. I'm angry that good people died while you stayed silent. But I'm not angry that you finally told the truth. And I'm not angry that you're paying for your choices. She reached across the table and took his hand. Her touch was gentle but not forgiving, honest in the way Victor had learned to be. Jimmy asked me to give you something, she said, sliding an envelope across the scratched metal table. Inside was a single photograph. Jamie Martinez at 19, laughing at something off camera, his whole life ahead of him. On the back, in careful handwriting, thank you for giving me my father back. James Martinez, Jr. Victor felt tears he'd held back for 20 years finally break free. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of a prison visiting room, surrounded by other broken families trying to find their way back to each other, he finally understood what Daniel had meant. Justice hadn't just caught up. It had set them all free. When visiting hours ended and Emma walked away, Victor returned to his cell carrying the photograph and something he hadn't felt since 2004, peace. It was the performance of a lifetime, playing the man he should have been all along. Outside, the California sun set over a city where the truth finally mattered more than the story.